did you know that guys walk here? Did you know guys walk here?
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of On Deck, discussions for the Black community by the Black community. And this is going to be a really good topic today. This is going to be our part 2 on education. You know, a few weeks ago, we had our part 1 where we talked about what is education and separating that from the school system that delivers education. And today we're going to start talking about education from the standpoint of how it's delivered, you know, whether it's public education, private, post-secondary, secondary to, you know, all the way to elementary school on up. And in this time that we're having right now, especially, this is a very important conversation for us to have with some of our children still at home and some of our children in the hybrid learning process. But before we dig into the meat of the conversation, let's introduce all of our panelists today. So we'll start from my top right with Miss Minnie Jones.
Peace, family. What's going on? I'm Minnie Jones, owner of joyfortheculture.com, and I am excited to be here because the topic of education is something that I hold near and dear to my heart.
And our special guest panelist for today is Dr. Curtis. Dr. Curtis was one of my professors at the University of Hartford, so I'm glad that she's able to join us. But we'd like to say a few words to introduce yourself to the people.
Okay, as Hanif says, I am Cheryl Curtis. I taught at the University of Hartford for 25 years. I started out in their 2-year program for underprepared students and eventually was moved into the education department where I taught introduction to education and ran the secondary education program.
All right, and Mr. Moss.
Hi, my name is Daryl Moss. I am publisher of the Metro Record newspaper and a proud member of the On Deck panel.
All right, now that we've got our introductions out of the way, and I want to jump right into this, you know, because one of the things that when we talked about education, we defined education by talking about the process of learning and how that can happen in a variety of ways and is not just restricted to going to a school. You know, especially in this day and age with the internet and with all of these different ways to share information. But today, when we want to talk about like the process of what it means to get educated, what does that really mean? I mean, I think all of us on this panel today have either worked in the schools, whether it's the public school system, whether it's a college, or we've been involved in higher education at some point as a guest lecturer or doing something. And with this environment that we've had of COVID this year, a lot of our children have been at home going to school. And there have been some interesting statistics coming out of it. There have been some people who have reported massive drop-offs in the grading, the quality of what their students have been getting. And some people who have seen their students excelling. So with that said, you know, I want to talk about the school system first, talking about, you know, K through 12. When we talk about that mode of delivery, you know, I'm curious as to what everyone's experience was, because we're all in this panel, we all come from different generations. So I'm curious as to what people's K to 12 experience was like, and do you feel that you actually learned in that K to 12 experience, like something that was actually useful to you today?
So the K through 12 experience?
Yeah.
Man, I'm trying to see if I can remember back that far. K through 12, I mean, it was interesting. For me, it was really interesting. I grew up in Bearded and get a little small town.
I'm sorry, but I'm having problems understanding Mr. Moss.
Okay. So I'm going to fix my audio while you guys continue talking. Let me correct my audio.
Okay.
Well, I would say that I had a great experience K through 12. I actually learned some valuable skills that I still use today. However, you know, I was always in, you know, accelerated programs. So even in like elementary school, I was in accelerated program. Same thing for middle school and definitely high school. I was in the IB program at Commerce. So I was very used to, the workload, time management. I was trained in the art of intellectual conversation, like we had roundtable discussions. So I had a good experience. However, I will say that I always wanted to learn. Being an educator in a public school system, I know that that's not always the case with students. I always wanted to learn. I was interested in learning new things. I wanted to soak up as much information as I can. However, my experience as an educator, as opposed to being a student, is very different. Seldomly do we come across, or have I come across someone who actually really, really wants to learn. For the most part, kids are disengaged and they're just not interested. So I can say that my experience as a student was very practical. But as an educator, I don't have that same experience and relationship with my students as it pertains to the desire to learn.
I too had a desire to learn. My experience is probably unique to the people who are a part of this panel. I grew up in the segregated South. I went to school in the 50s. I started school at age 5 because I guess they thought I was of the intellect and the age where I could be allowed to go to school before turning 6, which I would have done in January. So I started in September. I went to a school that began as a mission school for poor Black children in the South. And it was run by IHM nuns, Immaculate Heart of Mary nuns, and the Passionist priest. I am the youngest of 7 kids, and I had sisters and brothers who attended that school and needed to follow in their footsteps of achieving, which is what my parents expected. My mother only had an 8th grade education, and my father only had a 3rd grade education. So becoming educated was something that was very important to the family. The school was Catholic, as you can guess, it being run by nuns and priests. And my mother had sisters who attended the school when it was a mission school, and she was always very impressed with what they learned and how they learned to speak. And she thought that that school provided a better education than the local segregated schools in our town. I liked learning. Learning liked me back. My classes were double graded. So while I was in the 1st grade class, I would always listen to what was happening with the 2nd graders and learning what they were learning. And 3rd and 4th, the same thing, all the way through high school, where the classes became a little bit more level towards your actual grade. And as far as teaching, I have found students who really love learning. And not all of them, especially when I think about my early experiences in the 2-year college, where the job really was to try. These were students who we saw as having potential, but hadn't achieved that potential in high school. And we were trying to help them be more ready for a college experience and moving on to a 4-year degree. Students in that program, many students in that program, were eager to be learners. And sometimes I would question, why was this particular student not just admitted into a regular 4-year program? And, that there's some history there, I think, with the university itself. But it always was a pleasure to have students who, I can remember in one of my earliest years of teaching, a young woman who was from Jamaica, who was an excellent student. she would write me in the summer how she missed school and she just wanted to write a paper. And it's like, who are you? Where do you come from? She went on to get her master's degree after she graduated with a degree in psychology. She went on to get a doctorate. She taught at the college level. And she stands out in my mind in particular, but there were other students who really very much were into learning. And in the teacher education program, sometimes you would find students who would say, well, how much do I need to know to teach? Kindergartners. This is in the intro to education class. And then they learned, okay, there's not a lot that I have to know. And if we look at kids in school today who now have these standardized tests that they have to pass, at the college level, there were Praxis exam, Praxis 2 exam. Like, there's a lot that you need to know to be able to become a classroom teacher. So there were some who got it right away. Others had to be coaxed a little bit to move forward, but it worked. There was a balance there.
Mr. Moss, I see you're back.
I am back. You were talking about our K-12 experience. It was interesting. I think where I'm from, can you guys hear me clearly? Okay. I don't know. In that little city there, learning through the educational system was always challenging because we're a town where they had Ku Klux Klan rallies on an annual basis. We've had, I don't know. It's interesting. We had segregated classrooms in a public school system that was completely integrated. So learning for me pretty much came through my parents, who were really big on education. My dad's from Tuskegee, Alabama. My mom was from Antigua. So it's like most of the learning we received came from the home or through the church. I learned to read reading the Bible. So you learn those words and you learn to understand them and analyze them. And those are the conversations that we had. So we were always taught to go to school, you pick up what you can. And when you get back home, we'll go through your books with you. And this was the case basically all throughout my public educational experience. So do we benefit? Yeah, I learned how to navigate the process, having to work with them. But when it comes down to just, the knowledge base and intellectual capacity, I really can't say that the delivery came from the school system itself, but more so from what we experienced in the home.
No, that's interesting to hear because for me, I grew up in New York and I went to school in Long Island in a town called Uniondale. And growing up in Uniondale, when I was in like kindergarten, first, second grade, like the town itself was predominantly white. But as I got older, the town became predominantly black. And what was interesting about that is that in my K-12 experience, a lot of what I learned was more about how to think. And when I say how to think, it was developing the process of learning how to think for yourself. And the teachers, when they would find students that weren't engaged, a lot of the teachers, not all of them, but a good portion of them would change how they were delivering education. It would change the environment and to try to engage everyone. I haven't been in ninth grade in a very long time, and yet I still remember my ninth grade history teacher because he made like learning world history fun and engaging when it was boring in eighth grade. So I think a lot of what I experienced going through K through 12, where there were people that really challenged you as to what you were doing. And similar to what Minnie was saying, I was in a lot of the gifted and talented programs, and I learned a lot through those programs. But I think what also was interesting to me going through K through 12 in New York, and particularly where I went through K through 12 at, is that there were a lot of options available that I thought were standard everywhere. Just to find out when I left New York are not even standard from town to town, and because of those options, some of them I was able to explore, some of them I wasn't able to explore, but because of all of those options that were there, it gave me an interest in a wide variety of things. And I learned a lot of things in my K through 12, like that really still applies today. And I think it's an interesting segue because Dr. Curtis, you mentioned something, and I think for the most part, I don't thinking, I don't know if it was like this for you, Minnie, but there is such an emphasis today on standardized tests, standardized tests, standardized tests, teach to the test, and less of an emphasis on, actually teaching people things they need to know. Because when I look at the standardized testing that my son is in 7th grade. When I look at the stuff that he has to do for the standardized testing, I'm like, what is outside of the math? What does any of this other stuff have to do about learning and developing your brain and developing your intellectual capacity? So it's like, I think when we start talking about like this, sliding into like this mode of delivery of education, standardized testing has greatly impacted how education is delivered in this country and from state to state. We're one of the only first world nations that doesn't have a national educational standard, which I find kind of crazy. The standard is from state to state, and you can go in one state. Like I discovered math that I was doing in 7th grade in New York was math that someone in Enfield, Connecticut didn't see until 12th grade. I'm like, how is that possible? How is that there's so much of a disparity? So I think like not just because of the passage of time, but I think also the way standardized testing is emphasized, throughout this nation for education, it's greatly changed what's delivered, how it's delivered, and the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness it has on students. So, I mean, the question I want to pose to the three of you is, considering what your K through 12 experience was, and knowing what you know about standardized testing today, do you feel that standardized testing has made education better, or has it made it worse, the delivery of what's being taught?
So, having worked in the public school system, we definitely teach to the test, as opposed to, our students being positive functioning contributions to society. And I will say that it's not by the teacher's choice. I know many educators would prefer to teach the best way that the children learn, as opposed to the material that they're going to be tested on. However, we don't teach to the material and the strategies used for them to pass the test, then it appears that students are making progress, that the system's failing, and so on and so forth. And it really is sad, because a child could get how to do something relatively quickly, relatively easily, and maybe not necessarily as easily and as quickly as the strategies that they're being tested on, which I think are completely, they're mind-boggling, the way that they teach things now compared to the way that I was taught. And I know it must be even more mind-boggling, for, generations before me and the way that they were taught. So the standardized testing in and of itself, even if it wasn't full of bias, which it is, it's completely 100% full of bias. But even if it wasn't full of bias, it's not an effective strategy to teach by, and to be obligated to teach by too. It's definitely not. It's not effective in measuring progress. It's not effective in predicting future outcomes. So I'm totally in nations that are really more advanced than us academically. They don't use standardized testing. And if they do use standardized testing, they don't use it up until a certain point. Like their focus a lot of times, is in building good habits, establishing, quality character and values in students before they even get to information and whatnot. They teach them, how to keep their space clean, how to respect each other, how to respect themselves, how to wipe their butts. Just practical stuff that we don't teach, and standardized testing doesn't come into play at all, or not till way down the road. So we definitely need to do something about the standardized testing, even if it's just to eliminate the bias.
Well, to me, it sounds like when I'm hearing what you're saying, it sounds like to me that you're saying that the standardized testing, between the bias and the strategies that teachers are forced to use, isn't really helping to develop a class full of people that know how to think and have necessarily skills to be independent thinkers as much as it is to develop skills to make them more drone-like than anything else.
Definitely, absolutely, 100%. And to go off to build on what you said, we don't necessarily teach children how to think. You know, they are drones, and they're good at. They don't even necessarily learn material or know material. They're taught how to recognize material. And because of that, you know, when it comes time to apply these principles, there's a huge gap in what you learn and how to use it. And yeah, I would totally, standardized tests is definitely something we need to think about when we decide to send our children to public schools, because believe it or not, the standardized testing is really what pushed students to go back to school amidst the pandemic, even though the systems and, you know, the people who make that system work were, I mean, we had like basically 2.5 weeks to get our crap together. You know, like, hey, this is when we're going back in 2 weeks. And after being, you know, living a certain way for a year, like, it was crazy, but it was all motivated by the administration of standardized testing. So not necessarily what's best for the kids health-wise, mentally, emotionally, or the staff, but more so to be able to administer standardized testing. That's crazy to me.
Hanif, you began by talking about some of the recent studies that have been done that are saying that students have fallen behind during the pandemic, and I assume that there's some kind of standardized testing that they're doing to assess, you know, to come up with the numbers that say there have been declines. And I find that bothersome that, you know, it's you live by the test, you die by the test. You know, people have had to rethink how they teach in this particular environment, but the states are still falling back on the old ways of doing the measurement. And then it's the school system that will get blamed, or it's the teachers who will get blamed, or it's the students who will get blamed. And that seems to me to be very wrong-headed. I think that the standardized test can be very stifling. Post-retirement, I helped a friend of mine in a kindergarten class, and I couldn't believe the kinds of things that she had to do to prepare kindergartners for standardized testing. You know, the joy of learning was gone. And if she tried to infuse some of that in the classroom, that wasn't the kind of thing that got rewarded. So I agree with Minnie that they need to be rethought. And I do believe that there's bias in the testing as well. When you were in New York, didn't you have tests that you had to pass to move on to I just remember my cousins always being very anxious about the New York test. And well, I think they thought that they were getting a better education. I know kids that moved from the South and went to the North were oftentimes put back a grade because they didn't think that they were up to the level of the students.
I mean, I think a lot of that depends on where you are in New York. Like where I was at, there's certain tests that you had to pass in order to move to the next grade, but it wasn't necessarily standardized testing.
No.
It was, you had to have a certain proficiency in certain subjects according to the state educational system. And New York is also, I don't know if it still is, but it was the last state to still have what was called a Regents diploma for high school graduation. Right. So, you know, you had to pass the Regents exam in order to get the Regents diploma. If you didn't pass the Regents exam, you know, you would have to score a minimum of a certain amount and you can get a non-Regents diploma, but the Regents diploma was considered, you know, educationally superior because of the things that it offered. I mean, like that being said, one of the interesting things about that as well is that, you know, a lot of the children who got Regents diplomas, at least when I was living in New York, were the kids that were either in the accelerated track or they were in, you know, like New York had, like where I live, for example, they had what they call, they had 4 basic tracks. They had track 1, which is all the honor students. Track 2, which is those that they said were the average students. Track 3 with the ones that are below average. Track 4 are the ones that border on the special education area. And then there was an accelerated track for the talented and gifted learners, and an even higher accelerated track in English and history at the high school level for those who were considered humanities students. And so these tracks kind of like really dictated where you were going to go versus for Regents versus non-Regents diploma. Well, the one thing that was common in all tracks was the idea that you had to learn how to think. You had to learn what it meant to form a cohesive thought. And I think one of the things that comes down to that, when we were talking about some of these studies, one of the things, like I was talking to my son's principal at the beginning of the school year, and she was talking to me about the amount of students whose grades who were like doing phenomenal in school before the pandemic, and who can't really do this, like working from home, and are failing classes. And then she talked about students that were failing before the pandemic that are excelling during the pandemic. And I think one of the things that reminds me of is the greatest gift I ever received from the University of Hartford was on graduation day when Dr. Howard Gardner spoke. Dr. Howard Gardner, for those who don't know who he is a guy that has what he calls the theory of multiple intelligences. And he said one of the most profound things that's it's not new news to most people, but to hear someone say it, especially in a public forum like universities, was interesting. And he said that everyone doesn't learn the same way. And if you keep trying to force everyone to learn from this one method, you're going to take people that you think are bad students and say that they don't know how to do the work. And he said that really there is no such thing as a bad student, but there is a such thing as bad teaching. Because if you teach people the way they learn best, everyone can excel, which is what that elementary school on the campus at the University of Hartford is based off of, his multiple intelligences, theories, and curriculums. And the kids that go to that school seem to do a lot better than the kids that go to other schools, because they're getting education delivered to them in a way they understand. And I think one of the challenges that some educators have with a theory like this is they say, well, I've got a classroom of 25 people. I've got a classroom of 15 people. How do I teach each one the way they need to learn? But that's a failing of our training of these teachers. I mean, one of the biggest things that we have to remind ourselves when it comes to the standardized testing and the way it has negatively impacted our educational system is we have to think about the No Child Left Behind Act. And most people don't realize what that act really did and how it negatively affected education. The No Child Left Behind Act, is like, well, we don't want children being left with their, with their people, with the people of their own age. We need to find ways to advance them by still addressing deficiencies. But the No Child Left Behind Act also introduced more than $400 million to go towards the 4 companies that produce standardized testing, and to create all this layer of standardized testing that basically takes children from being critical thinkers into becoming drones. This idea in the educational system of the United States is not new. You look at when the Rockefeller family decided to get involved with education, with the National Education Board, that foundation that they created, the schools that they threw money into were the schools that took out financial literacy, that took out critical thinking, that took out civics, things that people need to learn and need to know. So it's interesting looking at education now, and then being a college professor, watching some of the students that I have, some of the students that I have in my class right now, it's like they think this is 13th grade and that they need to be babied, and that they need to be, they need to be given unlimited amount of chances to do things. And that's part of this culture that was created with No Child Left Behind. And I think if we don't talk about that, and we don't understand the impact of that law on education and what it's done to really kind of shift the focus away from building thinkers, innovators, entrepreneurs, building the next generation of leaders, into creating a generation's worth of drones, then we're going to do ourselves a disservice when it comes to educating our community about what this delivery of education is and what it isn't. And I think that's, for me at least, as an educator, that's one of the very critical things that I think about when it comes to educating other people's children, as well as educating my own child.
one thing, or I noticed the impact of No Child Left Behind when, you know, I became an educator, a paraprofessional about a year ago, a little over a year ago, and I was mind boggled by the fact that there were students who had perfect penmanship but were completely illiterate. Like they could not read, but they could write perfectly, legibly, clearly, and I thought that was just like mind boggling. And that's what comes to my mind when I think of No Child Left Behind. Just, you know, moved along and these participation trophies and things like that. And as a parent, you know, I was you know, meeting with the school, and we were talking about a test that my daughter took, and I'm like, well, let me see the test. You know, I can take it home and go over it with her if she needs more support. And they told me I couldn't see the test because, you know, that was their copywritten curriculum or something. And I was just like, what kind of cold black ops, you know, program y'all got going on here where I can't take the test home? I'm not trying to hijack your curriculum or whatever. And I thought that was shady. But at the end of the day, this is not an education system. Like how you were talking about, the money went to, you know, the people who took out certain practical, well-needed programs from the curriculum. And that just further reinforces the fact that this is not an education. This is an indoctrination system. Okay, even going through history, it's not accurate. It's not complete. They paint this picture of the nation that they want the students to grow up thinking is reality, and it's not. That is not education. That is indoctrination. I was reading a book, and I love the book because it was about Black love, Black marriage, or whatever, but they did not use the term slave. And when you talk about, you know, slaves in history books, and you introduce these concepts to impressionable young adults, what it does is it perpetuates this sense of inferiority for Black children and superiority for white children. And in the book, I loved it because they referred to, you know, slaves as bondspersons, like this bondswoman or this bondsman, bonds people. And I couldn't think of a term, but I knew that slave just wasn't it for me. And, you know, they teach about Thomas Edison, but don't teach about Lewis Latimer. So that's not education. That is indoctrination. And I know that, you know, we can't go from 0 to 100 and expect for all Black families to pull their students out, which I think is the best route to take, and also very simple. Not necessarily easy, because the two terms are not always synonymous, but very simple. However, we can supplement that education, because just like you said, Hanif, you know, a lot of your success in academia was due to your environment at home. So we can supplement that education through, you know, by leveraging our resources in the community. A lot of scholars that I follow, a lot of my favorite teachers, you know, they went to a Saturday school or a Saturday program, you know, that taught them who they were, that exposed them to the lies and the deception and the trickery and manipulation that they were being exposed to by going to school. So that is something that we can do. And like I said, it's very simple. However, our children are not being educated. They're being indoctrinated. What benefit is it to the white power structure if we're financially literate? What benefit is it to the white power structure if we are literate, period? And we can look at that, you know, for going back, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years. It's never been their goal to educate us, even to the simplest level as, you know, being literate, teach us how to read. But yet they subject us to so many contracts. Even fresh out of slavery, you know, we were subjected to contracts, and we were systemically illiterate. And that's still the case to this day. So we definitely, and I'm addressing Brother Stokes' question about the system being dated and can we expect it to free us? And no, we cannot. When I first went into school, and even to this day, I see a lot of elements in the school that are similar to prison. And it's about maintaining order and control. And I get that. However, you go to the suburbs, you don't necessarily have to raise your hand to go to the bathroom. You know what I mean? Or even, take a phone call. You get up, you walk out politely, you excuse yourself, and you do what you got to do. You need a minute, you take a minute, you go for a walk, you go off campus for lunch, you come right back. If you want to do that, because they got salad bars and all types of nice things in their real nice things in their cafeteria. They have programs where their high school graduates go right into a full-time job, making great pay, benefits. They have those pipelines that we don't have. We have the school to prison pipeline. And if we don't somehow supplement the education and teach our children who they are and what they're capable of, education is a weapon that's going to continually be used against us.
But I think you kind of get to an interesting point when you talk about, what we were saying earlier about creating an environment. I mean, the reality is that not every one of our parents can do that for their children because they don't know how to do that for themselves, first and foremost. But it also goes to, I think, the greater point of when you talk about education delivery, some of the greatest education I've ever received in my life and how it was delivered was never through the public school system. It was through the neighborhood, because I grew up in a neighborhood where people actually looked out for one another. When I was too young to be home by myself, I was either at the neighbor immediately next door, with the one across the street, or the one around the corner. And they would teach us some things that we needed to know that we were never getting in school. So I think we constantly confuse when we talk about, whether we talk about the topic of education, what is education, and the aspect of how education is delivered. I think we always associate that delivery with a school or a school system. And that's not the only way education can be delivered. I can remember when I was in undergrad at the University of Hartford, there's a lot of stuff I learned, I think outside of the Hart School, which is a music school where I was at, like Dr. Curtis was the first Black educator I saw on that campus. And so, there was a lot from just saying, hey, after class, that I learned more than being in class. And I think sometimes we forget that mentorship is another way of education. And if we don't open ourselves up, those of us that are capable of being mentors, notice what I said, those that are capable of being mentors, because there's a lot of people that want to mentor, but let's be honest, you're really not in a place where you should be. You need to get a mentor yourself. You're not in a place to mentor anybody else. But like mentoring is another form of education. The best definition of mentorship I've ever heard is learning from someone else's mistakes so you don't have to repeat them yourselves. That's education. Talking to that elder in the family who's teaching you things about not just who the family is, who the family was, but talking to you about things that you need to know about life. That's education. I think we keep putting education as this thing we only get in school. And that's why the topic of this was intentionally stated as delivery of education, because when we talk about educational delivery, there's so many ways, especially today, to be able to get an education. And when we talk about the school system in particular, I think one of the most important things we have to remember is that the school system will get away with what it can get away with as long as no one is watching. And I've said this on this program before, how there was a big issue in the town where I live about changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, not wanting to honor Columbus, and the idea of re-educating on who Columbus was, what he actually did, and things like that. And there were two people on the Board of Education who were very critical of this, who were saying that these people don't know what they're talking about, and people are getting their education from Wikipedia because Columbus wasn't this bad person that everyone's making him out to be. And one person said, we should celebrate the spirit of Columbus. So me, being anyone that knows me knows how sarcastic I can be. So my response to that was, okay, so in the spirit of Columbus, I guess it's okay for me to come to your house, make you and your family my slaves, take all your wealth, then go to whatever your family owns, take that, claim it's mine because I discovered it, even though you've been living there before me, and no one do anything about that because that's what he did. And the response was silence, because what are you going to say? But the issue is when people know that they can pull the wool over your eyes because either you're not informed or you're not participating to know what's going on, they're going to continue to do that. That's about education. It's about politics. It's about financial literacy. It's about community building. But the most important part of educational delivery that I think is missing, especially from some, not all Black communities, is the community. You know, I can't remember the last time I lived in a neighborhood, other than when I was growing up, where you actually knew most of the people within like a 5 square block radius of where you lived, where like every house was a safe house. So if something happened, and you weren't home, your children can go to the person next door and actually know who that is, and there'd be safety in that. Where you had the elders in the neighborhood that were willing to come out and talk to all the children, not just the ones that are related to them, and educate them about things that they needed to know. So I think a large component missing in the delivery of what we call education is the community itself. Now, this question I want to actually direct towards Mr. Moss, because Mr. Moss, you're very big in this community. A lot of people listen to what you have to say. There's a lot of things that you do, and you and I have had a lot of conversations about this. What do you think as a community we could do to reinsert the community as part of the delivery of education? You're on mute.
Yep, I'm trying to unmute now. I'm under the weather, so I'm moving kind of slow. You got to bear with me. I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about community involvement. It's really all about community engagement. I know back when I was a student at Southern Connecticut State University, we used to go to Yale University a lot just to hang out with the Black students over there. And while there, I met a number of students. There had to be about 10 or 11 of them. They were all attending school at Yale. They were all students. They all participated in the Freedom Schools, the Black Panther Freedom Schools. 2 out of Memphis, there's a couple out of Chicago. It was really interesting. They were some of the most brilliant kids I've ever met in my life. None of them had ever attended public schools until they reached high school. I think when we talk about re-engaging folks from a community perspective, I think it's all about utilizing our neighborhood resources. When we talk about what we have and what we don't have in our communities, I believe it has a lot to do with responsible community leadership, conducting what we call capacities mapping. We can teach young people in the basement of a church, in just a room in the library. There's just so many resources that we have. We have folks who have brilliant libraries and collections of all types of books. I think we'll learn much, much, much more I think our young people and our older folks will learn much more if we actually took on the mantle and we actually taught to a narrative. When we talk about public school systems, we're talking about how they teach to a narrative. They teach to a narrative of white supremacy. So just about everything you learn in those classrooms actually align with with that particular narrative. I think we need to do the same thing. I think we need to rely more on, as Minnie said earlier, Saturday school programs. We have one at the Boys and Girls Club Family Center here, in which every Saturday morning we're educating young people. We talk about racial perspectives in literature. We have long conversations about culture, and we reinforce that with books about our culture and how proud they should be of it. I think just little things like that really spark interest in young people. You have those that have, problems just presenting in front of the classroom. So as opposed to sitting in the back of the classroom, we go to the back of the classroom with the students and we stand up with them and we read with them. I think there are ways in which we can strengthen, both the intellectual capacity and the confidence of our young people. You said it earlier, we don't technically have to rely on public institutions to educate our children. I don't think they've ever been responsible. They never should have been responsible for teaching our kids. When I think of my dad growing up in Alabama, and he talks about the Little Red Schoolhouse, that their teachers were from the neighborhood, not necessarily solidly educated with numerous college degrees. They were just really good teachers. Everything else they learned came from family members and neighbors. The same as me growing up in Meriden, Connecticut. Not too much of a difference. I think in terms of our news media, I think we have to make sure that we're not just communicating news, but we're utilizing some of the real estate in those newspapers and websites to educate our people on things that we feel they need to know. Call it what you may, but we have resources that we have to utilize. I look at some people's Facebook pages, nothing but they use their pages as learning tools. And I think there are a number of ways in which we can educate our community and bring people up to snuff. But I think it's a conscious decision that we have to make in order to do that. Again, when it comes down to community organizing, organizing people around what the actual needs of our communities are. In terms of, we're talking about education and increasing intellectual capacity, we have to organize around that, and we don't do that. We organize around social justice issues, not realizing that the two go hand in hand. The more we educate our young people, the more successes they will have as they reach adulthood. You're muted.
Minnie, I saw you wanted to say something.
You know, a lot of us take advantage of alternative resources for education, and that's great to have these alternative resources. However, that by no means, overrides the need for a proper educational system. The only reason why, we can point out, seek out, and try to create these alternative resources is because the one that we have is inadequate. And while it's great to have those, the end goal should be a proper education system.
But what exactly is a proper education when we talk about the public school system, which you yourself stated earlier has failed our young people? So just expound on what you feel a proper education is. I'm just curious.
However, no matter the vehicle, right? Whether we go into massive reform for public schools, whether we create our own systems at any level, whether we're meeting in basements in churches or we're collecting money to have proper brick and mortar and institutions or whatever the case may be. I think in order to determine what we consider a proper education, like I said, it's a simple process. So we take what we consider an ideal adult and what they need to be an ideal adult or a positive contribution to society. What type of skills do they need to have? What type of information do they need to know? And we take that image and we work backwards and make sure our educational processes, our systems, and our curriculum is aligned with that end result that we want to have. Now, whether we teach certain things at certain ages or we teach all things to all ages, but just make it age appropriate, however the strategy, but as long as we have that big picture in mind, what do they need to know? What do they need to know how to do? What type of habits do they need to develop in order to be successful? We take that big picture and we work it backwards, and we test it and we test it and we test it until all those outcomes are, within the majority, or till we see a change in the way that our generation or the upcoming generation does things. To me, the proper education is, for a student to graduate and be able to be a positive contribution to our community. However we decide that looks like, whatever we decide that is. But it definitely has to be a collective effort. But we know we want them to, be able to count, be able to balance books, be able to write well, be able to, assertively and articulately express themselves, whatever those skills are. We take that big picture and we work backwards. And to me, when we can constantly predict that outcome for a majority of our students, then we're giving them a proper education.
I think that kind of brings up an interesting a segue here, because, when we talk about a proper education, we talk a lot about the public school system, but there are also private schools out there that, what they offer. Like I've taught I used to teach at a very exclusive private school that costs as much as a college here in Connecticut called Suffield Academy. And to watch what is offered to those high school students at that academy, it's like they come out of there so prepared in so many ways. And then to find out that in that particular school, some of the students that go there from other countries, you're talking about the children of CEOs of other countries that are going to some of these schools, and what they offer is so ridiculously different. Some of that is because of the fact that they have, from a financial perspective, more resources. And when you start looking at what the state educational standards are, you realize that the individual districts, as well as the private schools that open up and form, have more control over what can be taught than we're led to believe. There's a certain state standard that people have to meet, but it's not as specific as people make it. So it's based off of, it then becomes based off of, well, what textbook are we buying? And we're going to educate based off of this textbook. Or what test do we have to teach you? We're going to educate based off of this test. What I find very different about that is that when you start taking that and then you leave K through 12 and you go into higher ed, you go into undergrad and graduate school, it's a very different environment, and you start to see, the more and more you become familiar with what goes on before they get to you at the college level, you start to really you can almost map where some of your students come from. You can almost kind of figure out, you're from this state, yeah, you must be from this area, you must be from this area, or you can't be from this state, or if you finished high school in here, you must have been someplace else before you were here. And it's kind of interesting because at the collegiate level, you start talking about, okay, well, what is it that you're here to learn? And even at the collegiate level, there's a lot of majors, from my perspective, that they don't really prepare them to do what they're supposed to do in the first place. It's like I as someone who's in academia and who's a musician and a music teacher, one of the biggest criticisms I have about music education for performers is that, no, we don't really teach you how to be a musician. We teach you how to competently perform a particular style of music, but there's so much more to being a musician that should be part of your education. And in like fashion, it's like when you look at educational training at the collegiate level, there's so many things that are missing. The idea that not everyone you're going to teach actually learns the same way you do. Like, that shouldn't be a foreign concept. That should be something that's constantly discussed, but education program after program doesn't address that. You have some programs that are segregated on purpose, where you have someone that can be going to school for, they want to come to school for music education or music therapy or music management, and they've never seen an opera in their life. They've never heard classical singing in their life, but yet the school says the only way you can get in this program as a vocalist is if you can sing this bit of classical repertoire with it. So it's like we're constantly, whether it's at the collegiate level or whether it's at the K through 12 level, we're constantly having barriers to getting the right education delivered the right way to the right people. And I think, as much as we can say that this is also by design, it's also, and I'm gonna say this, and some people may not like it, but I don't really care if they do. But it's also because of our ignorance, whether that's willful ignorance or not, of what power we actually do wield in terms of changes that can be made, as well as what power that we wield in terms of the environment we create in our own homes, in our own neighborhoods, and in our own communities to empower our children as well as ourselves to be educated with the proper things. If financial literacy is important and the school isn't teaching it, then why aren't you figuring it out? Why aren't you learning it?
Yeah, I had a question for Mr. Moses when he was talking about community partnerships, and I wondered if those partnerships fed into the school. Were you also working with schools so that they were becoming educated about what you were doing with students in the community?
Yeah, so most of the programs that I work on, we do communicate it to the schools. However, the city of Springfield very rarely works with, having worked in the mayor's office for the last 12 years, let me be very clear. They very rarely work with community-based organizations, with grassroots organizations, unless they're state-funded after-school programs. Other than that, you have a difficult time getting in. You have a difficult time connecting what you're seeing with students with what the educational system is seeing with students. We've been trying to work with the schools. Not just my organization, but other groups as well have been trying to work with schools for over 10 years that I know of. So it's just a very difficult process. If you're not a part of the public school system, if you're not an educator, most educators won't respect the work that you do in a community setting.
And I think, like, when you talk about that, what that really says to me is, if we have these programs that are working and the city's not working with them, if I'm a parent in this city, my attitude is, okay, well, why aren't y'all working together? Because there's no legitimate reason you can offer me if this place is doing a better job educating my child than you are, and my child is in your institution is supposed to be delivering a certain quality of education, there's no reason why that there shouldn't be some sort of partnership here. I think we forget sometimes that as much as we talk about the way, whether it's educational system or the political system is rigged against our community, I think we still sometimes forget that there is still power in numbers. There is still power in gathering, and there is still power in being able to do certain things. We can talk about all we want about how whether the system is worthy of being reformed or not. But until we have an alternative, we have to be willing to do what we can with what's available. And whether that's working within the system, or whether that's working within our home, or whether that's creating a system within our own community to augment what's not being taught. And I keep bringing it back to this point because from my experience as a parent, forget my experience as an educator, my experience as a parent, I've had to be the number one advocate for my child. When they've told me that my child shouldn't be doing certain things, and I'm like, well, who says who? When they tell me my child is too far ahead in math or reading, I'm like, well, that's your problem, not mine. Then challenge him more, you know. And I realize this is a very nuanced conversation. I realize that not everyone.
As an organizer, as a community-based organizer, for me, it's like, and I know most of the folks that rock in my circle, we don't have time to worry about with some of the young people that we work with, whether or not the system embraces us or rejects us. Not my issue. My only concern is whether or not we can fill in the gaps with these young people that we're working with. For me, it's like, I can only speak for myself, and I'm not a formal educator like the rest of you guys. So let me just make that very clear. For me, what's more important is making sure that these families have the support systems that they need in place for their young people, to make sure these young people have the support to push them along so that they can understand that intellectually, they're on the same level as everybody else. Whether or not people have taken the time to work with them, to bring out their brilliance, that's what we're here to do. So when you talk about the role of community and community engagement, I don't think it's the community versus the school systems or the systems that are in place. The role of the community is to make sure that our children are educated, period. To make sure that they have the support system in place, make sure they have access to resources, make sure they understand that they're caring adults who will step in and fill and play the role of educator to ensure that they get what they need. So I hear what you're saying about the school system. You're right. It's not a matter of whether or not the system works in our favor, whether it's broken or whatever the case may be. The reality is, post-slavery, the system has never really been effective. We have those that rise to the top, they benefit from the educational system. But when you have conversations with these people, these black folks who have been successful, you find out their primary push has come from outside of the school system. Their primary resource or the support system is from outside the school system. Every once in a while, they may recognize a black young male or female and say, oh my God, this young person has the potential to go far. I'm going to work with them. But it's very rare. And then what do we do with all the kids who are blacklisted from elementary school all the way up? Every time they raise their hand, they're told to put their hand down. The system has been broken. It's not a question of whether or not it is or it isn't. It's worked for some. But when you look at the majority of folks, man, listen, we have so many kids out there that need this support. It's not an either or situation. When we talk about educational delivery, I think we should explore all options. And the focus, when you talk about whether or not we work with the school system, the minute they put their hand down and say, we don't want to work with you, we can't stop that work. We got to do what we do. We've been running our program for the last 6 years out of the family center. Whether they support it or not doesn't matter. When we get the feedback from the parents who are saying that my kid went from all D's and C's and they're getting all A's and B's and it's because of the work that you're doing, at the end of the day, that's what matters. When we have young people who come back as teenagers or high school graduates and they're like, wow, I learned so much with you guys. That's what matters because they're spreading the word. And I think as long as the community, again, capacity is mapping, as long as the community know about the resources that are there that they can take advantage of, I think that's what's important.
And I don't disagree with you. I'm going to say this and then Minnie, I'm going to get to you because I know you want to say something. I don't disagree with what you're saying. I guess my standpoint is that, we have to take all approaches that are going to work for the best interest of our children. And if we're not willing to take, and we also have to know which, when it comes to who's doing what, who can do what y'all know by now, Dr. Curtis, you haven't heard this from me yet. Y'all know by now, my favorite quote when it comes to this comes from The Rock. Know your role and shut your mouth. And what I mean by that is know what you can do. And if you are excellent at community organizing and supplementing what can be done from a community basis, do that. If you are excellent for understanding how an educational system works and how to weave in and out of it and to make changes, do that. But then also talk to each other to see how you can help each other, to make sure that the entire ecosystem of education between the community, the family, the school system, whether it's public, whether it's private, whether it's a homeschooling network, whatever that system is, that if everyone is invested in the same goal, and knows what their roles are and is willing to work together to make sure that no matter where the children are in the ecosystem, they get what they need. I think that's what's important, and it's something that used to happen, and in some places it probably still does. But I think it's a point to be made, because without looking at the whole and who can do what where, I think that you're going to always have some people that are going to slip through the cracks because they're either unwilling or are unable due to resource issues. But the more I think the more that we address the entire ecosystem, the less we have slipping through the cracks. I know we're running out of time. I just want to get to Minnie, and then I want to and let Minnie give her closing points.
I just want to address the boss's statement in the comments where he says we have to decide if this system is worth saving, or do we establish a new system? It is absolutely, and this is coming from me only being in the public school system where it's dominated by white women and gay males, that we can't abandon that system. We cannot afford to leave those kids absent our influence, supervision, and guidance, and leave them to the whim of the system in the school to prison pipeline. Because when we establish our new system, okay, you're going to have people that get it, and they're going to be on board and they're going to support it. And then you're going to have people that come later after they see the effects and they see the success, or they're just plain old fed up with the old system. And then you're going to have people who will refuse and reject it enthusiastically. They'll march through the streets and they will rebuke it, and they will stand by that old system. And we can't allow it to be to their children's detriment, because that's how you perpetuate a system that we're trying to destroy. So we have to do both. Most importantly, though, and I'll keep saying this, we need to raise good mothers on purpose. And I say parents matter, right? But I don't care what your family structure is. The mother is the first teacher to the babies. Even if only because that child is innately seeking out their mother's reaction, their mother's approval, their mother's attention. Not to say that fathers don't matter, but like Hanif said, know your role and shut your mouth. So mothers are the first teachers to the baby, and they have to know what to do within the first 3 years of life. Because like we've demonstrated, that desire to learn starts at home. You're not going to brush your child over the head in school to get them to want to learn. And not because they don't want to, but because it's just not practical with the time and the resources and the materials that they are given. So we have to raise good mothers. Like Hanif said, how are they going to want to teach financial literacy to their children if they don't know it? But I don't care how stupid you are as a mother. You want to provide your child with that which you were denied, even if you don't know it. And I think all mothers strive to do that. I don't care if they left you at the fire station. That was their goal. And they did the best they could do with what they had. I don't care how you feel about it. I don't care what your mama did to you, okay? So we have to raise good mothers to know that there should be certain stimuluses provided in your environment, different things to look at, certain ways you talk to your child. Like, don't just pass me that over there. No, pass me that little blue ball. So they understand language, and we can close a lot of those gaps, and we can eliminate all those biases on our own. But for one, we do need to focus on fixing the system. However we decide to do that, we do need to build our own system. But most importantly, we need to raise good mothers. And that's my closing comments.
Mr. Moss, closing thoughts.
Bottom line for all my viewers, I'll say this. If you have a child in the school system, if your child is progressing or you feel they should be progressing, then you need to look for alternative means. You need to assess your resources, some capacity mapping. You cannot rely strictly on a system that has failed historically. Pull your kids out, absolutely not. Make sure you find support resources for your child. At the end of the day, mother or father, you do what you do it in the best interest of your children. That's it.
Dr. Curtis, any final thoughts? You're muted.
One of the things we didn't specifically discuss was teacher education. So we need a good community environment. We need a good home environment. We also need good teacher training. So, honey, if you talked about multiple intelligence, which I found students more willing to accept than talking about cultural differences and the need to understand that and to understand their own biases. So that needs to be a part of the educational process that they take into school systems that need to change.
My final thoughts about this is that when it comes to the delivery of education, it's very multifaceted. If you think that education itself and the delivery of education is solely about the school system, whether it's K through 12, whether it's undergraduate or graduate, then you don't understand what education really is. Education begins, number one, in the home. That's the first place it begins. And if we don't cultivate the right environment, if we don't engage our community, if we don't make sure that we do the best that we can so that the right resources and right opportunities are available for education, not just for our children, but for ourselves, because, sometimes we need to re-educate ourselves. Education is a lifelong process. It doesn't end when you get a degree. It doesn't end when you graduate from high school. It is lifelong. Those that do well are those that are lifelong learners. And those that do well and those that keep continuing to innovate and do things that we see as agents of change are those of people that are continually learning. And if we want to build a generation of people and a community and a family and a neighborhood of people that, are the next innovators or the next giants of industry, or the next leaders, or the next community organizers, we have to make sure that the educational ecosystem that they have is a healthy one, is a viable one, and one that they're going to learn something that can help them into their adulthood and into their life as parents and as citizens of this country and as citizens of this nation and citizens of where they live. Because at the end of the day, the goal for all of us should be to make sure that we do the best we can with what we have and make sure that the next generation has an opportunity to do even better. With that being said, I want to thank the panelists that are here today. I want to thank everyone that's watching. We want to thank all of our viewers that have been with us from day one. And those, if this is your first day, we welcome you to come back again. We're here every Sunday, 3 p.m. We're going to sign off, and just a reminder, this program is for us. It's by us. And if there's something that you want to see us talk about on the program, drop a note on that Facebook page. Drop a note or drop a comment on the YouTube page. Let us know. Because this isn't just about what we want to talk about. We want to hear what you want to talk about, too. With that said, we'll see you next Sunday on Deck.
God's walked in.